So the first thing you want to think about when you're looking to actually do a bit of mudline fishing is picking the right part of your peg. And what I mean by that is you can see that mudline today, it's quite obvious where to fish. Well, that's what you would think. But when I plumb either side of the mudline, it comes up shallow. There's not enough water there. You want to try and pick a nice depth if you can, where the fish feel safe in that. And what I mean by that, you imagine the fish is as big as my hand. As it comes in, it's taking up a lot of room. If it's too deep, the fish can sit off the bottom. And this is why mudline's so effective, is because the fish aren't allowed to sit off the bottom in that depth of water. But if it's too shallow, they'll feel scared and they'll spook. So let me show you exactly what I'm going to do. When I'm plumbing up, I'm looking roughly for about 12 inch being the minimum, maybe 10 inch if the fishing's really, really good, and the maximum being about 18 inch. So I've got 14 inch here today, but I've got to be super accurate when I plumb up. So when I'm actually plumbing, I've got a little bit of tape on my pole here, and I'm holding that tape and I'm lined up with the little crack in the far bank. Now if I go to the left, you'll see it jumps up and it's really shallow there. There's literally 3 or 4 inches of water, so the fish are not going to feel safe there. If I go to the right hand side of my peg, again it's really shallow, but in the middle it's a little bit deeper, obviously where the fish have been feeding, etc. Now if I come back 2 or 3 inch, you see I'm off the bottom. So I've basically got one little spot right up against the bank, and if I move along that little spot, I'm on the bottom. Now you're not going to get it perfectly flat because the bottom erodes away and the banks collapse, etc. So what I'm having to do here is take roughly an average depth of where I'm always on the bottom. So I'm happy there, in line with that little crack in the far bank. If I go an inch or two to the left, I might be 1.5 inches, 2 inch over depth. If I go 1.5 inches to the right, it's quite nice, still quite flat. If I line up there, I'm bang on perfect depth, so a body of my float out of the water, which is about 1 inch over depth. If I come back just a few inch, maybe 1 or 2 inch, I'm just touching the bottom, so I've got a little margin of error. So basically I'm going to push it as tight to that bank as I can get it. I'm still going to be about 3 or 4 inches off the bank because I can't push my pole tip any further because the actual mud there is undercut slightly, which means that my float looks like it's 4 or 5 inch off the bank, when actually that's as tight as I can possibly get my rig. I can't push my float any further than that. So that's where I'm choosing to fish. Like I say, take an average depth. I've got a little flat spot there. I'm just going to push it against the slope. And you can imagine it's a little bit like a ski slope. And that ski slope, you're just laying it against it. So if you have a bank that's quite severe, just go a little few inches more over depth. What you might have to do is push your bulk up another inch, 1.5 inches, and that'll just allow you to get your hook bait on the bottom. Sometimes that's how you'll be plumbing up. Today I'm choosing to fish here. That 4 inches behind my float is basically no water there. So you can imagine the bank's there. This is where I'm choosing to fish, sort of the edge of my collar, if you like, there, the edge of my sleeve. That's where I'm choosing to fish, and I can just lay my bait on the bottom and hopefully the fish creep up and then we get his bite. So the next thing to consider is the actual rig you're going to use. Now, this is pretty simple. The only thing you would change is probably the hook, the elastic, and that's it. You know, maybe the hook length, depending on the size of the fish, but the actual mechanics of the rig stay the same. So today, because I'm fishing for F1s and an odd decent carp up to say 5-6 pound, and it's a snake lake venue where the fish can't really run off a great deal, I've chose grey hydro elastic, so that should be pretty much fine for fish up to 8 pound. If there was all 8 pound, then I'd probably step it up, but today we could be catching anything from £1 to £6 with an odd bonus, so grey's perfect for that. Mainline, I've got 019, so really durable. I could use this rig for carp if it was all carp. I could also use this rig for F1s if it was F1s. 2 number 9 cubes, and that just allows me to get my float right up against that banking. Quite a shortish line as well. I don't want to be catching on any bits of debris across or anything like that, so quite a shortish line. Not too short where if the wind gets up it starts to get a little bit awkward, because you're fishing at sort of 15 meters here today to get onto the mud line. I want to make sure that I can actually sit there and I'm not fishing with a little 3-4 inch line and moving my tip all the time. The float virtually never changes. 0.4 bagger, fiberglass stem, because again, we're going to be catching on our net when we catch fish. And you'll notice here, I've marked it with a little bit of Tipp-Ex, because a lot of the time you'll catch a fish and your float might just slide an inch. And if I'm an inch shallower than what I started and I plumbed up at, I'm going to be off the bottom, and then I'm going to foul up more fish or not even get bites. So I always like to just put a little bit of Tipp-Ex just as a reference, just so that I can slide this back, because this is the type of rig that will get moved about a little bit. I've got real strong rubbers on there. I've got the 0.3 mil Guru silicone, so it's really tight, and it is quite hard to actually move the float, but it's just a little tip for you. 2 mil bristle, fiberglass stem, really strong, really durable. And then a little bulk of 6 number 8s, and that's just going to dot the float almost to a pimple. I've got that 2 mil bristle on, so I can still see it nice. I don't want loads of bristles showing. You don't tend to miss lots of bites when you're mudline fishing, because it's shallow. The fish generally creep into your peg. They're not sat off the bottom causing a lot of liners. So bite wise, you don't need lots of bristles showing. If it goes under, it's generally a bite. The thing you've got to watch out for is when it gets pushed to the sides. They're normally your liners, and that's the reason you want a nice heavy positive rig. So 6 number 8s, and then a little 3-inch hook length, and I've got a 16s SLWG to 0.15, because we've got a chance of catching a few carp, and I'm going to be fishing a bit of worm on that. If we're catching a lot of big carp, then we could also step up to a 14s. So you've found your spot and you've got your rig set, everything's right with that part of it. The next thing you've got to consider is what you're going to actually feed there. Now for me, because we've got about 14 inches of water, ground bait is the #1 choice for me. It's the most attractive bait you can get. It's really fine, particles, got loads of cloud coming off it. It's not actually going to fill the fish up. They can eat ground bait for hours and hours and not fill up. There's no sort of like food content in it, if you like. The other options are, say, micro pellets. If you was catching all F1s, you could fish worms and casters, etc., and maggots. But ground bait for me will catch you everything from a little stocky carp, little stocky F1s, to big F1s, big carp. It'll catch anything that swims. And for 14 inches of water, perfect. When would I not use ground bait? I wouldn't use ground bait if it was any deeper than sort of like 22, 24 inches. So when you get into that sort of 2 foot sort of depth, ground bait can get wafted about a lot. But in 14 inches, anything from sort of like 10 to 20 inches, I always feel ground bait is the best bait, because you've got all that cloud going through the water, very little food content. Is a brilliant way of drawing the fish in. So what we choose to feed is very important. Now, another thing you can do is sometimes add micro pellets to your ground bait. But that depends how good the fishing is. If the fish are swimming through your peg really quickly, sometimes they need some food to actually stop and eat. They're searching through that ground bait and there's nothing for them to actually eat. So it sends them a little bit nuts sometimes. And that's when you can add particles into your mix. So you can add anything into it. There's no set rule. All depends what the fish want to eat at that venue. Sometimes dead maggots is great if you're fishing for a lot of carp. Sometimes adding some micro pellets into your mix and making like a 50-50 mix of micros and ground bait is great when you're fishing for F1s and carp as well. Sometimes putting a little bit of meat in there could be good. It's very rare that I'll fish hard pellets in conjunction with a ground bait. It's normally soft, smaller baits like maggots, worms, you know, baits. I say smaller baits, sometimes a target bait can be great. So today we could be fishing a little piece of worm if we're catching F1s, we could be fishing a full worm if we're catching carp. So think about what you're trying to feed, think about what you're trying to actually catch. If we've got a lot of carp in our peg, like I say, we could add a little bit more micros into the mix, we could add a little bit more dead maggots into the mix, even casters into the mix. But today, because I feel like the fish are in a little bit spawny mode, you know, the bright sunshine, flat calm, it's going to be a pretty tricky day. I don't want to fill any fish that come up in, fill them up, any fish that come into my peg. So I'm just going to feed neat ground bait on its own, and I'm going to mix it quite damp so that it gets down to the bottom. If we're not getting lots and lots of fish coming in the peg, then we need to think about volumes of baits. That's the next thing I'm going to touch upon. So the next thing you've got to think about is volume of bait, how much to feed. Now sometimes if you're not going to go straight on that mud line, say you want to start on the short pole, you need to put some bait over there and try and gather the fish. Think of this like a margin line but across on the far bank. So as the fish gain confidence, typically they come in the margins later in the day. This is a great way to catch them margin stamp fish early in the session. So if I'm not fishing it, what I would normally do is I would take a pot full of ground bait and I'd go and put that in. Now, how much to feed is really important. You can see here I've got 2 big cups. If I was fishing for carp, 300 ml is a great size of cup for carp. It's enough bait where carp are quite greedy, it's going to bring them into your peg, but it's a little bit too much for F1s. So for me, 200 ml is a great starting point. I also have an 100 ml pot, but it's not great for dragging a lot of carp in. So I like to use my 200 ml pot. I can half fill it, but basically I would normally just fill this to the brim, and I would start the session with about 200 ml of ground bait to kickstart my peg. It looks like a lot of bait, but again, there's not much food content in, so don't be frightened of feeding like quite positive with ground bait. Now, once that's in the peg and we're building it up, that bait might last around about 20-30 minutes before the fish have ate it or they've not come in on it and we need to feed again. So it's a great way to sort of what I call big pot, get the fish into my peg, and then hopefully by the time I go on it, there's something lingering in and about that mud line. Once we've done that and it comes to actually fishing itself, we then need to work out how much bait we need to feed. So here I've got the new fast release pots. I feel like the small one is not enough bait. If I'm fishing with ground bait and I'm fishing for F1s and carp, the small pot, that little bit of ground bait, is not enough bait to hold any fish. So I would never personally use that ground bait in the summer months when I'm fishing for carp, or F1s even. The 2 pots I'm going to go to is my medium and my large. Now medium is great for F1s or if you're getting a lot of fish coming in your peg, because when there's a lot of fish in your peg, you don't need to feed as much. You don't need to attract them because they're already there. So this is a great way of calming the fish down and making sure you've got just enough bait to get a bite. But 90% of the time, my go-to pot is the large, and that's the one I'm going to be fishing today, probably with like half a worm on the hook. For me, it's just enough bait to hold them fish in your peg. It's almost like feeding a little nugget every chuck, and that's enough bait to feed regular, very similar to what you'd put like round a small method feeder. That amount of bait for me is just the right amount. It's enough to get a bite. If I don't get a bite, I can ship back in, put a little bit more in. If I'm not getting any fish in my peg, then I might need to big pot it again. So what I might find myself doing throughout the day is put a big pot in, get some fish in the peg, kin the pot over the top just to set a little trap, catch them 1 or 2 fish that are lingering around, and then if I'm not getting any signs of fish again, I need to draw the fish back in. So therefore I'd go back out with another big pot, try and drag them in. Eventually you'll have enough fish coming in your peg where you can just kin the pot it regularly, and I'll just fish with a large pot on my pole, and then basically hook baits is all what's working at the particular venue. Dead maggots, worm, meat, corn, baits like that, they all give you a chance of catching some fish. For me, maggots and worm are probably 2 of my favourites, and that's probably what I'll end up sticking with today is worm. Coming out of spring into summer, you tend to find worms a great hook bait because the fish are spawning. You can see a few fish thrashing in the reeds today. They want them amino acids, and worms are a great attractor at this time of the year. So leading into the summer, baits like meat and corn could be great for carp, dead maggots, even live maggots. If you're catching a lot of F1s, 3 or 4 live maggots on the hook's brilliant as well. But today we've just got a simple approach, ground bait and worm, absolutely perfect combination for fishing on that mud to catch a bit of everything. All I've got to think about then is how big a piece of worm to put on. F1s might put an inch long piece of worm on, maybe 2 inch long. If I'm catching a lot of big carp, might even put a full worm on. So now I've got everything in place and you're ready to start fishing. What I've actually done here today is I've fed this about 20 minutes previous. I put 200 ml of ground bait in there just to get some bait in while I was talking through the first few tips. And I can already start to see signs of fish. And what I'm looking for here is any little tail patterns, any little swirls, but also discolouring of the water. So the water's going a little bit browner now and again. There's not millions of fish there, but we're getting some signs. So the fish are willing to go into that depth. They might be a little bit spooky. I've seen one spook itself. And this is where, when you have a colder night like last night and it's a little bit brighter, the fish can just be a little bit wary of going into really shallow water. But if you get a really warm day, the fish love being in that shallowest water. So it can vary day to day. You might have days where they're in there all day, and you'll have other days where nothing really happens for a couple of hours, but then as the day warms up, the fishing gets better and better. And this is really good on snake lakes when it's tight pegging, because the days when they don't want to come in the margin, or you ain't got a margin because it's too deep, and the only bit of shallow water you can actually find is across on that mud, Sometimes you treat this as like your last hour and a half where you've got a chance of catching some big carp. You're not going to catch loads of big carp fishing in front of the reeds where it's like 3-4 foot deep. They're going to want to be in that shallow water, and that's why margins work so well. And this is basically all a mudline is, it's a far bank margin. So starting off, fill my pot right to the brim, make sure it is overloaded. You want to fill it up to the top so you know you're feeding the correct amount. We don't want to be half filling it, and then all I'll do is I gently press it in just enough so that it holds when I turn my pot upside down. And then when I get there, because I've got the fast release pot on, it'll just melt out of the pot. So you've got to be super accurate with this. So make sure that's right. I've got half a piece of worm on the hook. Spoke about the rig and everything, so all that's in position. All I need to do now is get to where I'm fishing, look at my marker, and basically get it as tight as possible to that far bank where we've plumbed up. So I feel that tape in my index finger and I push the rig forward. So as I push it forward, just reset that rig. As I push it forward, turn my pot and I put that pot on the water. I'm just going to lean forward 1 inch just to compensate for my pot being back an inch. And as I lift my pole float up, again I push it in. Just make sure that bulk has come right underneath my pole tip. If I push it too far, what will happen is my float will pop up a little bit because it gets shallower towards the bank. The rig will actually be sat on the bottom. So there, I've just edged it up, my float sat nice, and now I've just got to wait for the bite. Now, the fish could waft my bait everywhere here because I've got no protection either side of my rig. So if I miss an opportunity, all I've got to do is come back in, start again. Once you miss an opportunity in that shallow water, you have to come back and set your rig again. Don't sit there letting fish, waft your bait everywhere, because you've not got a little pile of food in one little spot. They basically come in and knocked all that food off your dinner plate, so you need to refill up that little dinner plate. So now all I'm going to do is sit there and wait patiently. I've basically fed my bait, my hook bait's on top of it, and I'm just waiting for them fish to creep up that shelf onto that mud line, and hopefully we get a nice clean bite and we can try and pick off a few of these better stamped fish. Now, one thing that's important when doing this style of fishing, you can see the fish is coming from the right hand side of my peg. Them two little back shots that I've got, I can just hold them to the right hand side because I know the fish is going to push the rig to the left. So by having the back shots to the right, hopefully it keeps it on that little spot a little bit better. So I'm almost anticipating which side the fish is going to come from. Sometimes you won't see them, but then other times, right, it's coming from the right, I can see it tailing. Get your back shots in position ready, otherwise it can push your rig off the spot. So there we had a nice clean bite, and you can actually see my mud line is coloured up a little bit, which is great. You want colour in the peg. When the mud line colours up and your ground bait colours up, all that's doing is giving the fish more and more confidence. I'll take my time with it. They're a really nice stamp of fish in this particular lake. We're on Covey 5 at Partridge Lakes. Probably got the best stamp fish in all of the coveys. Actually a nice carp to start with. Now if I was catching a lot of these, I could quite easily fish black hydro, but at the moment I've got grey on. Take my time, should be able to land them. Use that puller kit just to get a bit of control on it. I'm not trying to pull its head off. We've not got a massive hook on, we've got 0.15 to a 16s, but you can see there, nice stamp fish, just turned at last minute on me. Here he comes. There we go. And that is a typical carp for this lake, probably 5, maybe even 5.5 pound. Just hold him up to show you, because that is a perfect example of what we're trying to catch. Right up. Don't be making me look silly on camera. That is a perfect, he's done it again. Calm yourself down, pal. Bit lively from spawning. I'm not going to try and hold him up because he's going to make me look silly, but that is a perfect example of the size of fish that we're trying to catch on that mud line. So let's get him back. Off she goes. And that is brilliant example of what we're trying to do with this. So all I'm going to try and do now is just repeat the process. If I can go in and just feed that amount of bait, hook bait, half a worm, get a bite and start again, great. But what might happen as the session progresses is I'm feeding this amount of bait and nothing's happening, nothing happens. So then you'll be thinking, well, what do I do now? And that's the time when you might have to introduce a bigger volume of bait, maybe come off it, do something else, and then go back on it when you see signs of them. When they're there and they're there in numbers, that should be enough bait to hold the fish in your peg. When they're not there though, don't be scared of feeding, because the only way you'll get fish in your peg is by feeding them and drawing them into your peg. So if you're not catching, don't just come off it without feeding. Get your big pot, your 200 miller, give it another 200 miller ground bait, get some bait back in, drag some fish in, then you can go back to the kinder pot. But the biggest thing here is accuracy. So I'll show you one more time. When it comes to being accurate, remember, you ship out there, and once you get to your little spot, you've got your tape in my index finger. I push it through so my back arm is straight, my elbow and everything's nice and straight. I turn my pot over, I lean forward 1 inch, pot on the water, hold it, 1, 2, the pot will release the bait nice and easy. Lift your float like 2 inch just so it edges on top of that bait, just so that your bulk comes underneath your pole tip, and I'm perfectly in line and smack bang on top of that bait, and then I can sit and wait for my bite again. And then hopefully the fish comes in, you catch him first time, because if you don't catch him first time, what tends to happen is your bait spreads about and then it gets a little bit messy. You need to come back and refeed. If you miss your opportunity, don't sit there, come back, feed again. You've got to be busy at this style of fishing, but the better you work and the harder you work, the more fish you will catch doing it. But remember, accuracy is key to success when you're doing this. So you can see there, I've hooked another fish. This one's going a little bit mad. This one's another carp by the looks of it. This is where black probably would have been a little bit better. I said to you before that there's nowhere to run, but this one's a little bit angry. We've got him under control now. He's coming back towards us. So once I've got him back to my top kit, again, I can see a little bit of cloud coming up on that mud, which is perfect, because that's going to give confidence for fish to come back a little bit quicker. So I'm going to take a couple of strips of that puller kit. I think I need one more strip just to gain a bit of control on that fish. Just take your time with it, there's no rush, he's under my feet now. It's another decent fish. Another common carp, probably like £4. There we go, we got him. Again, those lovely stamp fish, probably like £4.5. Just let him go. And that's a perfect example of what this mudline style fishing can capture.